want to follow along, feel free. We have a good sized group today, so we'll be, I like to keep things interactive, so I'll be asking you to kind of post things in the chat and kind of participate today. So I'm really excited to get started. So first thing I'm going to ask you all to do, I know that you already kind of shared your name and location, but I'm also curious if you have what your current role is, if you have a topic area for your talk that you'd like to speak on. It can be very general. It can be, you know, Angular or backend, but just kind of curious if you have a topic area you'd like to explore today. And if you could also post if you're a first-time speaker or not. So again, your name, location, your current role, if you have a topic area, and if you're a first-time speaker. And while y'all are doing that in the chat, I'm just gonna kind of tell you a little bit more about myself and my history as a speaker. So like, you know, as was said during the introduction, I attended the full stack software engineering bootcamp at Georgia Tech in 2019. And thanks to the support of Women Who Code, I actually gave my first talk in October of 2019 for one of the Women Who Code front-end webinar series. And so after that, I gave my first conference talk in February of 2020 at an Atlanta conference called NG Alt. And then in June of 2020, gave my first kind of virtual national conference talk at IoniConf. So the reason I tell you that is to say that you don't have to have years of experience. You don't have to be an expert in, you know, in everything. You don't have to have somebody who has years and years of public speaking experience to be able to give a tech talk. And so today, as we're going through the workshop, just kind of keep that in mind that we all start somewhere, and it's definitely very possible to do this even if you're earlier in your career and your learning. So some of the goals for today, my goal for the workshop is to demonstrate a simple framework for developing a tech talk. I want to go through the process so you can actually practice and understand which areas to focus for additional learning. Like I said, this is going to be pretty interactive. It's a workshop, not just a webinar. And I want you to be able to walk away with an actionable problem statement and then make progress toward an outline for your tech talk. So by the end of this workshop, ideally you have an actionable problem statement and you're kind of started on your way to developing your tech talk. I'm also going to cover some basic presentation skills and then share some resources for additional learning. The focus of this talk, though, is on the framework for creating your outline, for creating your problem statement. I won't dive too much into presentation skills because there's a lot of content out there already on that. So please feel free to take advantage of the extra resources that we'll be presenting. And just a couple quick guidelines, you know, be kind and encouraging to your fellow attendees. Make sure we're abiding by the code of conduct. We're going to have working sessions throughout the workshop where you can ask questions, and we'll be able, I'm asking if you could reserve your questions for those breaks. It'll make it very clear that this is the time that you can do Q&A. And then you can use the Q&A function to ask me questions. There's a Q&A function in Zoom, and then use the chat to discuss with your fellow speakers. And then I do ask that you participate. You know, this is a safe place to try new things and to learn what works for you. So if I'm gonna ask you to kind of do some different prompts and put some things in the chat, and please take advantage of the opportunity to practice and get some feedback. Awesome. So the first thing I want to dive into is the problem statement for your talk. So what is the problem you are trying to solve for your audience? You can also may hear this called like a thesis statement or a topic statement. There's a lot of different ways that you can refer to this, but the idea is that this is the problem that you're trying to solve for your audience with the talk that you're presenting. So there's a couple different types of problems that you can solve. The first one is technical problems. And some examples of these may be, there's a particular feature or concept that's difficult to learn, and your audience wants to learn that. It could be that they need a real world solution for a very specific challenge or use case. Another example of a technical problem that you can solve for your audience is if they're interested in a new tool, but they don't know where to start. And then another example is I'm trying to make a decision and need analysis of pros and cons. So these are all examples of technical problems that your talk could solve for a user or for an audience member. There's also business problems. So for example, I understand how to use a tool, but not the best applications for it. I want to better understand how to build or leverage non-technical skills for my career. So for example, I've done talks that are technical about, Ngrx, very specific technical testing topics. But I've also done a talk about, the junior road to development and the types of ways that you need to learn skills and the different types of learning. So that's a non-technical business problem that could be solved by a talk. Another problem is seeing best practices from other teams helps me better understand how to guide my own team. So if you have best practices to share, that could be a problem that you can help solve for your audience. And then finally, I need to quickly understand a concept or non-technical skill to solve a problem on my team. So these can be really great things like, communication, conflict resolution, project management, prioritization of features. These are all non-technical business skills that are also very, that can solve a lot of problems for your audience. So when I format my problem statement, and again, this is the format that we're going to be using throughout the workshop today, but this is just one framework. This is just one format to help get you started. But I like to say in this talk, I will do something. I will do a what, by, how you're going to do that, so that why. So the what is what you will accomplish in this talk. The how is how you will accomplish that goal. And the why is why it matters to the audience. So in this talk, I will blank by blank, so that blank. So to see this as an action, in this talk, I will, and this is an exact problem statement from a talk that I did on Ngrx. So in this talk, I will, and the what is demonstrate best practices for testing with Ngrx. And again, that's the problem that you're going to solve. And you're going to solve that by highlighting common testing use cases for actions and selectors. And that's the how. That's how I'm going to solve the problem. And then the why is so that you can quickly implement a testing strategy without getting too bogged down with complex technical details. And again, the why is what's important to the audience. Like, why do they care? So the entire statement goes, in this talk, I will demonstrate best practices for testing with Ngrx by highlighting common testing use cases for actions and selectors so that you can quickly implement a testing strategy without getting too bogged down with complex technical details. So in one sentence, the audience will know what they're going to learn, how they're going to learn it, and why they should learn it and why it's important to them. Okay, so now we're going to have a working session. And so in this working session, I want you to take 5 minutes and write your first draft of your problem statement. So if you have kind of a general topic area, if you don't, feel free to just pick anything at random just to practice this process. But again, if you could write your first draft of, in this talk, I will what, by, how, so that, why. And feel free to discuss ideas in the chat. And then if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function. We do have quite a bit of participants, so I prefer if you can use the Q&A function just so that way the chat can be reserved for your responses. Okay, awesome. So there's a question here from Priya. Is it preference given to technical talks, or is preference given to hands-on demo sessions? So I'm not sure if you're referring to the kind of conference specifically, but in general, I would say that I have found value from all different types of talks. I have given technical talks, I've given non-technical business talks about, my journey and my bootcamp experience. I've also given workshops where I've, in my day job, I work at Cypress. I'm a technical account manager, and I do a lot of trainings on Cypress. So I've given very hands-on demo sessions where I have my code editor open, I'm typing, we're running tests, we're writing tests, and all different types of talks have their value, and they have their place in the conference. So I would say for this workshop specifically too, no matter what approach you want to take, as long as you're following the format and the framework, this will kind of help you get started with an idea if you don't have one yet. So it's a great question. Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome. And I love it. See, it looks like we have a couple of experienced speakers in the chat, which is great. I got my start, like I said, with doing some meetups locally. I started with in-person speaking back when we could do that before every pandemic and everything, before starting with my first webinar in October. So I love seeing a lot of first-time speakers, recent bootcamp grads. That's excellent. Um, Career navigation, some great topics here as well. Okay, and then remember, as you're working on your problem statement, if you could post it in the chat. So again, in this talk, I will blank by how, so that why. And if anybody wants to see the example again, I'm happy to go back to the previous screen. So I'll give a few minutes for y'all to work and pop some answers there in the chat. And then if you have any questions or if you're stuck or you're not sure where to start, please feel free to raise your hand as well. All right, so Dolores posted hers in the chat, and this is an perfect example of the format. So in this talk, I will talk about the importance of tech in the Tourette's community. That's the what. By, and then the how is explaining how tech has helped my son with severe tics, and that's the how. More schools can consider using tech for students with moderate to severe Tourette's. So that's the why, and that's a excellent example, Dolores. Thank you so much for sharing. So in that case, a person who is interested in this talk will read that problem statement and they'll understand exactly what they're going to get out of that talk and why it's important. Awesome. Okay, so we have some more coming through. So Leah, I will help you craft a plan to begin writing technical blog posts by sharing example articles and tips so that you will feel more confident and ease around sharing your technical expertise via blogging. Perfect example there too, Leah. Great job. Okay, Rosanna, I will walk through a work project on failure detection on imbalanced data in the semiconductor industry by highlighting various clustering and anomaly detection methods so that you have new ideas for dealing with classification type tasks on imbalanced data. That is awesome. That's a really very technical topic too. So I think that that's really great how specific you're being with the how. Sometimes with very technical topics, it can be difficult to explain the how part, like what you want to do, why it's important, but describing how you're going to do that. And so highlighting various clustering and anomaly detection methods is a very specific how, and that's excellent job. Awesome. So I'll give a few more minutes for some more responses to come through, and then we'll move forward. Again, if you don't feel like you want to share, just make sure that you're writing this down on your own so that you're getting the most out of the workshop. But thank you very much to those who have shared, and excellent, excellent ideas here. I love to see these. Okay. So that's your problem statement. That's essentially that's if you think about that, that's like the first sentence of your abstract, right? If you're going to submit for a CFP, that is your thesis statement, your problem statement. That tells you everything that you really need to know before diving into some details. So once you have a problem statement and you essentially know what you're going to be talking about, the next step is saying, okay, so how am I actually going to deliver this talk, right? Oh, great, we got one more here. In this talk, I will discuss strategies for debugging code in JavaScript by demonstrating a strategy for code review. You will leave the workshop as a more empowered and efficient developer. I love that. I love that you tweaked the format a little bit to make it your own, and it's still super effective, and you covered all the points there. Awesome. So we'll keep moving just for the sake of time, but please keep popping those in the chat and feel free to give feedback to each other as well. Love the participation. So the next step, once you have your problem statement and you know what you want to talk about, is developing your outline. So this quote here, how will you structure your content for maximum impact? This comes from essentially a presentation by Gleb Bamatov, who is from Cyprus. And he talks a lot about effective public speaking. So he's a very experienced speaker. This presentation is actually from a while back, but the content is just as effective and helpful as it was today. So definitely recommend checking that out. But this quote here is, how will you structure your content for maximum impact, is something that I've really learned from. And that kind of guides the format and the framework that I use for developing the outline. So the outline structure, and again, this is just one framework. This is kind of the approach that I take. Feel free to tweak it to what works for you. But I start by giving the audience the right information at the right time. That's the most important part, is that you want to make sure that you're giving them the information that they need and when they need to get it, and not too soon or too late. You can adjust this outline based on talk length, format, or topic. You can make it your own, or you can throw it out and start from scratch. But the one that I use is I start with an introduction. So typically I'll do a speaker bio unless I have a speaker introduction. I talk about the purpose and the goals for the talk. And then I like to include my contact information, I share my Twitter handle or something of that nature, but it's something just to kind of set the tone for what's about to happen. Then I dive right into the problem statement, right? What is the problem? Define the problem and why is it important? So in this case, within your problem statement, when you're giving your presentation, you may repeat that. You may say, this is what I'm going to be talking about today. This is the problem we're going to be solving, and this is why you should care. After that, I move into what context do we need? So if you think about kind of past, present, and future, right? You start off with the present. You start off with saying, this is what we're going to talk about. Then you go into the past and you say, this is what you should already know. So you kind of give the context and the information that they should already have before you can start talking about that problem. So this may include prerequisites, any use case details, and then defining terms and concepts. So for example, when I gave my talk on Ngrx, Ngrx is a state management tool for Angular. So typically you will want to have some Angular knowledge before you talk about Ngrx. Additionally, I was specifically talking about testing Ngrx. So you also want to have some knowledge about unit testing. So those are some things that I may say, if you probably should know Angular, probably should know about unit testing before we dive into this talk. You'll also want to give use case details. So in this particular instance, I had a demo app that we were writing tests for. So I would give the context of that demo app, show, okay, it's a to-do app, this is how it functions, this is how the code works. And then defining terms and concepts. So in my Ngrx talk, I talk about actions and selectors. Those are two concepts specifically from Ngrx. So I defined those concepts first before we talked about how to test them. So this is kind of, again, the past, like what do we need to know before we can dive into the problem? The next step is the actual meat of the talk, right? How do we solve the problem? This is the how. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this. You can tell a story. So for example, this is how we solve the problem on our team. So if I was talking about testing Ngrx, I may say, okay, we had to implement this on our team. We didn't know how to start. This is how we did it. You can also teach a concept. So again, this is typically what I like to do. I don't necessarily have a lot of specific professional examples because I'm newer in my career, but I do like to teach. And so I may take the approach of teaching a concept as a way to solve the problem. You can also demonstrate a solution. So you can say, you can use this tool or concept to solve an abstract problem. So it may not be a real world business case, like as if you're telling a story, but you could say, for this hypothetical problem, this is what the solution would be. So when you get to the meat, kind of like the main part of your presentation, of your tech talk, it's how do we solve the problem? Again, there are some ways to approach this, telling a story, teaching a concept, or demonstrating a solution. And then the next step, so again, after we've kind of talked about how we solve the problem, is now we jump into the future. Where can we learn more? So I'll include things like next steps, additional resources, and again, contact information for either myself or if there's other partners that I'm working with, or if there's information, about like the founders of Ngrx, for example, then are the developers for it, then I'll include that information as well. So to recap, the outline structure. Start with the introduction, speaker bio, kind of the purpose and the goals of the talk, setting the stage. Then, what is the problem? What are we going to solve? Why is it important? Again, this can come right from your problem statement. Number 3, what context do we need? Looking into the past, what do we need to know before we can talk about the solution? Then, how do we solve the problem? And again, you can do this by telling a story, teaching a concept, or demonstrating a solution, or any other variety of ways, but those are the most common that I've used before. And then finally, you look into the future and you say, how can we learn more? What can we do with this information and how can we take it further? And there's a question I wanted to ask. So what if the point is that the attempt approach was cool, but didn't work out to what the customer wanted? So that's a really, really great question. And honestly, we can learn a lot from things that don't work, right? How many times have you tried something and then it didn't work and you had to debug it and you had to figure out why, and then you ended up learning so much more because of that, right? I mean, I know that all of my, like we call them failures, but really they're just learning opportunities. So those can be really great examples too of, because it could be that a lot of other people may take that same approach. They may say, oh yeah, like that sounds really neat. But knowing what didn't work is also really valuable and really important. So that's a really great question. Okay. So again, back to the outline, introduction, what is the problem? What context do we need? How do we solve the problem? And how can we learn more? So we're going to take some time here and we're going to do another working session. And I'd like to take a few minutes and kind of think about what solve the problem method works best for your problem statement. So if you go back to the problem statement that you generated during the last working session and you look at that how, right? So if you say, for example, Debs here says, in this talk, I will show how to use a behavior development tool called SpecFlow. So your development or automation team can begin writing integration or end-to-end tests before coding begins to help shorten the software development lifecycle. So when you take a look at how you're going to solve the problem, which method works best for yours? Are you planning on telling a story, teaching a concept, or demonstrating a solution? And then I also want you to think about what concepts will I need to explain to my audience before we get started? Like, what are those prerequisites? What are those terms that I need to define? I think a really great example was Rosanna's like really technical topic, right? Highlighting various clustering and anomaly detection methods. So in that case, it may be to be like, okay, like we need to, you should have some knowledge and understanding about this industry or what these detection methods might be. That could be something that would be a prerequisite. So take a few minutes and we will go ahead and please put your answers in the chat. And then you can also use the Q&A for questions, and I'll be answering questions as we go along here. So again, what solve the problem method works best for your problem statement? And then what concepts will you need to explain to your audience? Yes, there's a question about we'll be able to access the recording later. So yes, I believe this is going to be posted on the YouTube channel. So there's a Women Who Code, the YouTube channel where all the videos get posted. And then again, the slides are also public. So make sure you grab that slide link. It's just, I can post it here in the chat again. So make sure everybody has it, because it probably got pushed up a little bit there. Yeah, thanks so much for your participation. It's great. I love seeing all these ideas too. I can't wait to see some of them on stage. Okay, so I'll give it a few more minutes. Again, if y'all could pop some answers in the chat, again, around what kind of solve the problem method you would like to work on for your outline, and then what concepts you think you'll need to explain.
I just wanted to say one thing just because I noticed it in the chat a little bit, but when you're posting to the chat, make sure you click panelists and attendees so that others can see your responses.
Yes, thank you for that reminder. I did the same thing at first. I just posted to the panelists. So that is also an option too. If you don't want to share wide, you can share with just the panelists and that I'll be able to see it. But just keep that in mind that I will probably be reading it. So panelists and attendees is the best place to share. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward, but please feel free to keep posting those in the chat about the outline discussion. The next topic that I want to talk about is visuals and interactive elements. So essentially, this is talking about how you can incorporate visuals to make the most of your message. Again, there's a lot of different formats when you're doing a presentation, and some of them work better than others, and some of them will work better for your style than others as well. So let's talk about a couple different techniques. So speaking is a visual, auditory, and interactive medium. It's not like reading a blog post. It's not like listening to a podcast. It is like it's not like attending a meetup. It's all three, right? There's a lot of different types of learning that are taking place when you're giving a talk. You want to leverage this format wherever possible. So you don't necessarily just want to replicate the experience of reading a blog post. You want to take advantage of the fact that it's a multimodal learning experience. And so multimodal just means that you're learning in various different ways at the same time. So visuals and interactive elements should enhance the content, but not overtake it. You don't necessarily want somebody to walk away from your talk and say, wow, there was a lot of great GIFs and those slides are really cool, but I don't really remember what I learned. So they should, ultimately, the most important thing is getting your message across, right? Getting your message across is the #1 goal. You want the audience to get what they were expecting from that problem statement. You want them to be able to walk away with that. So you can use visuals to guide the narrative of your presentation. So as you can see, I'm using slides and I use them pretty heavily in order to direct and organize the content that I'm presenting. I probably wouldn't be very helpful if I just, for this workshop specifically, if I got up here, didn't have any slides and just talk through all of this, right? Having visuals allows me to guide the presentation and keep things organized. You can also use it to graphically demonstrate a concept that is hard to explain with words. So this can be really helpful if you have, for example, when I'm talking about APIs, I like to use flowcharts to demonstrate the relationship between the front end and the API. And I'll have different graphics and to demonstrate that because it's a concept that's a little bit hard to understand with just words. You can also use visuals to highlight key code samples that are critical to the understanding of your topic. I say highlight key code samples because I've done this before myself where I put a giant block of code on the screen and it's hard to really understand what you're looking at, especially when you only see it for a minute or two. So So slides.com, for example, has syntax highlighting where you can just highlight certain lines of code and allows you to walk through and explain those very specific lines. But if it's something where you really need to understand that syntax, or you need to point out, like, look, like you need to use async await here, that code samples that are critical to the understanding of your topic is a great way to use visuals. So using interaction. So when I say interaction, those are essentially ways that you are communicating with your audience. And you can use interaction to ask audience questions to confirm understanding and encourage engagement. So one of the things that I'd like to do, especially if I'm teaching a concept and not like necessarily demonstrating a solution or telling a story, is throughout the presentation, I'll use like poll questions and say, okay, like of the thing we just talked about, what was the most helpful for you? Or as we go along, I'll, like we have our working sessions in this workshop where I'll ask you to post in the chat. So if you want to ensure that everyone's on the same page as you're moving through, that can be a really great way to use audience questions. You can also do live coding and demos for when seeing the concept in action is critical to learning. So as I mentioned, I work at Cypress and I do a lot of trainings on Cypress, and we have a Cypress test runner. The test runner is a graphical user interface that runs your tests, and you can see everything clicking through. That is something where it's hard to explain, even just what I just said, right? You probably have no idea what I'm talking about unless you've seen it before. So in those examples, using a demo or live coding is important because you need to see it to be able to understand it. And then again, you can also use polls, show of hands, and other tools to create a unique experience for the audience. Again, when you're presenting live, this is a point in time interactive experience. So if it's something where, yes, you can go and you can watch the recording afterwards, or you can go back and you can review the slides. But if you are interacting in polls, if you're communicating in the chat, that gives your audience a very unique experience at that point in time and encourages people to attend live. That's really the goal, is to get that kind of interaction and create those one-of-a-kind experiences for your audience. And I've used tools like Slido before, which allow you to do interactive polls. I've used Mentimeter for Out in Tech, which allows you to do like quizzes and games and all kinds of things. And there's also the built-in tools in platforms like Zoom, or if you're using Twitch, where you can use the chat, you can use emoji reactions, hand raises, and polls, and even things like breakout rooms to promote interaction between your audience members. Okay, and so I want to also talk a little bit about some presentation basics. I don't spend a lot of time on here because I'll be honest, I love presenting. I did theater, I did music growing up, so it's something that comes a little bit naturally to me. So I'm not the best person to talk about it versus other people who do kind of have who get nervous. But it's very normal to be nervous. Right before my IoniConf talk, which was probably the biggest the first biggest conference talk I ever did, I thought I was going to pass out. I was on Zoom, just like waiting for the thing to come on. And I'm like, I'm going to legit pass out right now. But I did it, so it's very, very normal to be nervous. It just means that you care. But the way to prepare against, the way to battle against nerves is preparation. The more prepared you are, the more practiced you are, the better you're going to be able to handle those nerves in the moment. So some of kind of presentation basics. Nerves are normal, like I said. For me, I have an issue where I tend to talk quickly once I get nervous. So we're practicing that slowing down, keeping an even tempo. That's something that I had to work on. You do need to actually practice. You can't just think about practicing. You can't just run through it in your head. If you can find an audience, a trusted friend or somebody from your work or your boot camp who will listen to you and give you feedback. For my IoniConf talk, I recorded myself on my screen, just kind of giving myself a talk. And one of my wonderful coworkers watched it for me. They watched the entire, hour-long presentation and gave me feedback. You also would want to talk like you would to a colleague. So I've seen a lot of presentations where they're very formal, which is fine. And I've seen a lot of presentations which are more casual, which is also fine. For me, I like to strike a tone right in the middle. I like to talk in a way where I'm talking to a colleague so that my language is clear. I'm trying to communicate an idea for their understanding. I'm not necessarily going to use, very complex language or words if I don't have to. I'm going to try and default to what's going to be the most concise and the most clear, but also professional. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I'm seeing some really, really great responses in the chat. And putting googly eyes on your webcam, I've been told this before, and it's a really great idea. Sometimes I have a hard time maintaining eye contact with a camera because it's not a real person, right? And that's something that takes some getting used to. And so if you can, I've also heard people say you can put a little picture of an audience right above your webcam in order to kind of replicate that same experience of talking to a real audience of people or talking to a real person. Okay. And then you also want to consider lighting, audio, and background. Again, we're all working from home now, or not all of us, but a lot of us are working from home now. It's not going to be the same experience that it has been, but I've invested in I got a ring light that works with my natural skin tone because the white ring lights washed me out. So I got one that had yellow tones. I definitely try to always have a quiet background, and I try to use, a nicer microphone, nicer headset when I'm doing calls, just to make sure that there's no distractions from the content. Because again, the number one point is getting your message across. Awesome. All right, got some questions here, so I'm going to go ahead and answer. If you get feedback that people are not understanding, do you build in branches paths for further exploration of that concept? Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I like to do as I'm going throughout the process, so for example, I do a Cypress dashboard webinar, and I'll do poll questions along the way. And so if I get to a point in the middle where I ask a question like, how familiar are you with the Cypress test runner? And I see a surprising amount of people raise their hands and say, I've never used it before, then I will take an additional 5 minutes, a little detour, and I'll pull up and say, okay, let me give a quick demo of that then. So it's not something that you can do every time, but as you become more experienced and as you become more comfortable with your content, you can almost think of it like modules in JavaScript, right? Where you say, okay, I'm prepared to talk about this, this, and this. And then depending on what the audience feedback is, I may also need to bring in this, or I mean, this topic isn't actually everybody already knows about the test runner, so I can just cut that out. So I definitely always like to, because again, if the number one goal is to get your message across and you're getting feedback that message is not getting across, then you want to adjust for that. So that's a really great question. And then, some question is, can you give a list of tools that you recommend? Yeah, I definitely recommend Slido for interactions. We use that quite a bit. I love slides.com. That's what I'm using now. I'm lucky enough that I have a Cypress account that I can use for it, but it has some really great tools for embedding videos, for embedding code samples. It's just a really great, easy to use tool. And I don't necessarily love designing slides. That's not my graphic design is not my skill set. So it makes it really easy to do that. And then as far as practicing, I love to just use Loom to record myself so that I can see how I'm presenting, so I can see if I'm looking at the camera or not. And that's another great tool that I like to use. And then for noise cancellation, I use a tool called, is it called, I think it's not called CAP. It's called Crisp. It's called Crisp, and it's essentially built into your computer, and it helps to remove noise in the background from your microphone. Awesome. So I'm seeing a lot of great tips in the chat, which is fantastic. I love this. The googly eyes, that's great. And yes, talk slowly. And so one of the things that I do too is I put time checks in my speaker notes. So as I'm going along, I can say, okay, you know what, at this slide, I should be at this time. At this slide, I should be at this time, so that I know, okay, you know what, I need to speed it up, or I can take a little bit extra time and cover this concept or not. So I definitely leverage speaker notes in order to keep myself on track. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of practice here with the presentation. So I want you to practice a short introduction where you introduce yourself and your problem statement. So below is a sample script, but feel free to make it your own. So you'd say something like, hello, my name is Cecelia Martinez. I am a technical account manager at Cypress. Today, I will be speaking about testing with Ngrx. In this talk, I will, and then you'll go into your problem statement. So I would, Oh yeah, there's a couple of different Cypresses. So this is Cypress, the testing framework. There's also a Cypress semiconductor company, and every once in a while I'll get emails about them. And I have to say, that's hardware. I don't know what you're talking about. This is testing. But yeah, so yep, exactly. Yeah, the semiconductor company. We get some emails from them every once in a while. But so what I'd like to do is take 5 minutes, and we'll go ahead, and if you could write up your problem statement, and then if you are open to getting feedback on your statement, raise your hand, and I think we can see if we can unmute and share so that people can try it out and get some feedback on their statement. So again, if you're comfortable giving this practice statement for the group to get some feedback, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, you can practice it yourself as well, So I'll give a few minutes for y'all to write those up, and then we'll see if we have any volunteers. And also feel free to ask any questions at this time too. And then just kind of one comment I wanted to make about choosing a topic. Choosing a topic can seem very daunting, especially if you don't necessarily have a lot of experience in anything. Are you at the point where you feel like, oh, I'm not an expert. Like maybe I don't feel like I can talk about this. But the thing is that if you're a beginner, it can be difficult to learn from an expert, right? Because an expert is going to communicate in the way that they know to other experts. Whereas a beginner is going to talk about the things that they've just learned in that kind of beginner language. And I found that by talking about beginner topics, so for example, I did a talk on, I've done writing, I've done talks on GitHub, and I am by no means a GitHub expert, right? But it's something that if you are a beginner and you're used to hearing, and you hear somebody who's an expert talk about it, and they start saying, oh yeah, all you got to do is like clone the branch, and then you got to fork that, and then merge it, and you're like, what is happening? Whereas a beginner is going to give you very detailed, like, this is what I did, this is what I did wrong, this is how I fixed it, and that can be really, really helpful as well. So it's just kind of it's something where choosing a topic can be something as simple as, what did I get wrong yesterday? Like, what did I have to research more? What did I need to dive into? And then taking a look at the notes, like if you keep a developer notebook, which I highly recommend, keeping a developer notebook about everything that you're learning, then you can also look back at your notes and say, you know what, this is something that I had trouble with at first, but now I feel pretty good about. I can probably teach that to other people, and that can be very, very valuable. Okay, so there's a question to come through. I think I have 3 topic areas. Thoughts on narrowing down when it is a broadish seeming thing. Yeah, so for example, if you have a real world project and it's kind of a really broad process. So if you think about So say you have a project and you want to give some kind of presentation on that project, and it could be a number of different things. You could approach it from different angles. Think about that initial question, right? What problem are you trying to solve for the audience? And so if you have a project and you can think of, maybe it's written in Nux. Like I did a new blog and I used Nux, which is a view framework. And I could have talked about a number of different things, but I decided to talk about specifically, I told a story. Like, this is how I used Nux to build a blog. But you could also have approached it from, the top 5 mistakes that you make as a first-time Nuxt user. That could be the problem, in which case you're showing what not to do. You could also present it as, just teaching a concept. So what I ended up doing was I did unpacking the Nuxt content module, which is one of the modules that I used for Nuxt. And I just essentially went over the features and the basics of it. So when you have a really broad topic, think about what problems could actually be solved within that topic or within that concept, and dive into that as specifically as you can. Awesome. Oh, great. Thanks for sharing, Leah. Yes, so let me go ahead and pull up the link to my blog. It's it's ceciliacreates.com. But then I also have my dev.to. I blog on dev.to as well. So I'm going to share that link too. I'm going to specifically share my beginner GitHub guide, because that is an entire series and it's gotten a lot of some good feedback on it, especially. And I think that GitHub is something that is very important to learn as a developer. So that's the beginner GitHub guide. But then in general, I blog on ceciliacreates.com as well. And that's the same site that I build with Nuxt. You'll probably recognize the color scheme. I love teal. So awesome. So we have some great statements coming through. Machine learning failure. I love, semiconductor production process. I love how technical this talk is. You don't necessarily see kind of like hardware as often, which I think is really great. That's something that is not my wheelhouse at all. So I'm always really impressed with it. Yeah, and I did just do a webinar on Wednesday about more intermediate GitHub topics. So it's called Stepping Up Your GitHub Game. So that was recorded, and it will also be on the Women Who Code channel as well. So we have a few minutes left. Thank you for popping your statements in the chat. I did want to share this link as well, and I will pop it in the chat too. But first time I gave this presentation back in August, I asked on Twitter, so, just kind of what more advice would you give to first-time tech speakers? So this thread has quite a bit of comments, at least like 84 in August. I'm sure there's more now. So there's a lot of really great information to glean from that post. Just, if all else fails, crowdsource. That's something I learned when I was in journalism. So definitely recommend checking that out and getting some additional tips from a lot of really great speakers. And then, as you're aware, if the purpose of this series is to encourage, speakers to contribute, if you would like to speak for Women Who Code, please reach out to fellows@womenwhocode.com. You can also, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm at Cecelia Creates on Twitter and also on GitHub. Always happy to give feedback to first-time speakers about their abstracts or, about their outlines. So I would love to hear from you all if you do have any questions about your outlines or your problem statements or topic ideas. We always, are looking for speakers for Women Who Code events on the front end track. And there's a lot of I know that even just from seeing the problem statements in the chat today, there's some really, really great information and insight that y'all can bring to our community. And it's a really, really great way to give back as well. Awesome. So I also have the upcoming events link. I know that was shared earlier, but I wanted to just leave a couple minutes here at the end. If you have any feedback on this workshop, if you have any questions. Okay, so this question is, does Huck have to be front end? Absolutely not. So we have a wide variety of digital tracks for Women Who Code. We have, I know that there's data science,